Today we're going to be talking about osmosis, which involves or is related to diffusion and homeostasis. But before we can really get into osmosis, you have to know about diffusion and what diffusion is. And so, in general, there's all these different types of substances, such as food and water, and they're made up of particles, atoms, and larger components are the molecules and the ions. And these particles are constantly moving, they're always moving. And so there's a constant motion going on. And whether it's a solid thing such as a desk, a liquid like soda or water, or the air you're breathing, the molecules are all constantly moving. Sometimes we forget that a desk, which is solid, is made of atoms that are moving. They're moving extremely slow, so slow that it seems like it's it forms a solid, but the molecules are still moving there. And so if you think about particles, particles move based on how they're crammed together, so their proximity, how close or far apart they are, and how close particles are to each other in terms of a solution is referred to as the concentration. And in this image here, you can see that the drop of dye is very concentrated to one spot. And it hasn't been dispersed out, and so eventually it'll spread out, but it's very concentrated in that spot. And so during diffusion, particles move from an area of high concentration, such as in this first glass here where the dye is very concentrated, to an area of low concentration where equilibrium is met and the molecules of water and dye are basically equal. So here you see that the dye is very concentrated, and over time it continues to disperse throughout the water and even more here, and then it's kind of consistent or equal throughout. And this whole process of molecules moving from a high to low concentration over time to reach equilibrium is called diffusion. And in regards to cells, diffusion is a way to allow cells to get the nutrients and water they need. And without diffusion, cells wouldn't survive because there's a constant moving of molecules across the membranes of cells through diffusion. And here is an example of a chicken cell or a chicken egg, and you see this here is the membrane. The thick skin-like structure is the membrane right here, and that's where the particles cross. The particles cross the membrane. And some other examples of diffusion include spraying perfume. If you spray some perfume, it's very concentrated where you are, and eventually you don't really smell it anymore because the molecules disperse out into the room. And if you think of how a room can be very large, it'll even out and you don't really smell it anymore. And cooking is another example. If you're making cookies and you have to mix the batter together to make it all evenly dispersed, you don't want chunks of flour in your cookie, so you have to stir it up very well to make sure everything is consistent. And the same thing goes for Kool-Aid and water. You dump the sugar or the Kool-Aid into the water or the tea, and it all sinks to the bottom maybe, but you stir it up so that it, or if you just let it sit there, it'll eventually diffuse into the solution itself, but you stir it up to make sure that it's evenly dispersed. And now we go into osmosis. And osmosis is a form of diffusion, but it's mainly, or it is, the movement of water across a selectively permeable membrane versus diffusion, which is the movement of any substance from a high to low concentration. Osmosis only deals with the movement of water. And of course, since it's a form of diffusion, that the movement of water is from an area of high to low concentration. And to remind you, a selectively permeable membrane is a membrane that only allows some things to pass through. And going further into selectively permeable membranes, you know, it also they also serve the purpose to protect the cell. You don't want anything going into your cells because you probably it would throw off your homeostasis and it could probably even kill you. So, and if you think of our skin as a way to protect our body, things can't always penetrate our skin. Some things can, but not everything can. You can think of the cell membrane as a type of skin to the cell. And another example is the blood brain barrier, which the blood brain barrier is a way to protect things from getting into the brain. Only some things can pass it. And unfortunately, some bad things can pass it, although some toxins might not be able to penetrate that barrier. Things such as HIV can cross the blood brain barrier, so, and get into the cells. So it can be either good or bad things passing through the membranes. And we have passive transport, and diffusion and osmosis is a type of passive transport because it does not require energy to move the particles. The particles are moving from a concentration where there's a high amount of substance to a concentration where there's a low amount of substance. And it doesn't require energy. It's kind of like letting a ball roll down the hill. All you have to do is let it go and it'll roll by itself. You don't have to force it to roll. And during passive transport, molecules just move back and forth to reach equilibrium. And it'll move down that concentration gradient until there's an equal number of particles or water on both sides. Or not necessarily water, but the concentration is equal on both sides. And it usually involves the movement of small molecules that can easily cross membranes if you're referring to a cell. Active transport, which is the opposite, requires energy, and it's the transport of a substance against the concentration gradient. So you're moving something from a low to high concentration, and it's kind of like pushing a ball up a hill. You have to use some force to pushing the ball, especially if it's a huge ball. And so you're using energy to do that. And this usually occurs when large molecules need to be taken into the cell and they're not able to just simply pass through the membrane. And thinking of active and passive transport of across the cell, it's important to know the different types of solutions that undergo things such as osmosis and passive transport. And so, first of all, a solution is something that's made up of a solute and a solvent. A solvent is a liquid in which the solute is poured and dissolved. So if you think of water, water is something is a solvent. So if you have Kool-Aid, a package of Kool-Aid, you're going to pour the Kool-Aid into the water and that Kool-Aid will be dissolved into the water. Hence, the Kool-Aid in this case would be a solute, which is the substance that is dissolved in the solvent. Usually, a solvent's always a liquid. A solute is could be a powder, it could be a solid, it could be different things. And also, going back to this, a solute can also be, and you want to make sure you write this down, it can be ions, any kind of molecule. It doesn't necessarily have to be a large thing. And thinking about that, there's different types of solutions, and this is where we go into tonicity. And tonicity is just, excuse me, a way to describe the concentration of a solution. And so there's three different types of solutions that we see. And when you're thinking of a solution, it doesn't necessarily have to mean like a jar of water with Kool-Aid. It could mean something inside of our body, such as a cell in the environment that the cell is in, as you observed in the osmosis lab. And we'll talk about that later. But a hypotonic solution is a solution that has a lower concentration of solute than another. And so, and then a hypertonic solution is a solution that has a higher concentration of solute. So, in this case, a hypotonic solution, if you think of the sense of a cell, inside a cell, there's lots and lots of things inside of a cell. And there's so much water, so much water inside the cell. So if you just stuck a cell inside of a beaker of water, for example, if you think of the egg from the osmosis lab, it's a cell, a giant cell, right? And you stuck it into water, the water would travel into the cell. So the solution would be, the water would be hypotonic because there's not a lot of particles besides water molecules floating around in the solvent. So the water is going to flow into the cell. Versus a hypertonic solution that has a lot of things going into it. So if you think of vinegar, which is a weak acid, but since it's a weak acid, that means there's a lot of water in there, but there's other things going in there, or maybe that's not such a good example. So how about sugar water, for example? If you have a lot of sugar water, then there's a lot of things floating in that water compared to regular pure water. And so a sugar water solution would be a hypertonic solution because there's a lot of solute mixed into the solvent. And so if you stuck a cell into a concentrated sugar water solution, water would flow out of the cell into the solution to try to reach equilibrium because there's the concentration in terms of water is lower on the outside of the cell. And the isotonic solution is where both the concentration inside the cell and outside the cell are the same. So although there is a net movement of water, so water is flowing in and out of the cell, there's no change in the size because there's the concentrations on both sides are equal. But remember, molecules are always moving, so there's always going to be some movement across the two. And here's a picture of a hypotonic solution, or a cell that was placed into a hypotonic solution. So think of a cell placed in water. The water, since there's definitely a lot more water, the solvent outside of the cell, it's going to flow into the cell. And since water is flowing into the cell will increase in volume because it's gaining water, so it'll get bigger. And in some cases, if it absorbs too much water, it might even burst. In the case of a cell in a hypertonic solution, there's more water inside of the cell, and this would be that sugar water example that I gave you. And so water would flow out of the cell, and it would cause the shell to shrivel up and shrink. And some of you saw that with your egg after it was in the syrup. And here's an example of an isotonic solution. Equilibrium is already met. Water is flowing in, excuse me, in and out of the cell. And in and out of the cell, and so there's no increase in the cell volume because the same amount of water that is entering the cell, it's also exiting the cell. And so that last example, especially the isotonic situation, leads us into homeostasis. And homeostasis is basically a term to refer to maintaining a constant environment. So not only do our cells try to maintain a constant environment by using diffusion and osmosis to transport ions in water, so does our body. Our body is usually at a certain temperature, and it tries to maintain that temperature. And an example of our bodies, because we've kind of already talked about the cellular level, it's moving ions and water across the membrane to maintain its environment at a larger level. Our bodies, for example, if we start getting too hot, we'll start sweating, and that's a mechanism. Usually when you sweat, sometimes there's a breeze and it causes a cooling reaction to keep your body cool so that your temperature isn't increasing as much. And sometimes, goosebumps when you're cold, that leads to a mechanism your body is trying to use to keep itself warm. And even if you think about like our bodies, you can't have too high of a temperature, or you can start getting brain damage. Like different things can happen when your body starts to shut down because the temperature is too high. So our bodies go through a lot of different measures to keep the environment the same, like at the optimal level of functioning, and so does our cells. So overall, quick little review. Something to remember is that our cells use diffusion and osmosis to passively transport particles in water. And it also uses active transport, and again, that's when like larger molecules needed to be transported across the membrane, some proteins, things like that. it requires energy such as ATP to move those things. And in general, both active and passive transport of substances is used by our bodies to maintain homeostasis. And so lastly, a way for you to check your understanding is to answer these two questions at the end of your notes. The first one, in 2 to 3 sentences, briefly describe the relationship, similarities, and differences between osmosis and diffusion, and also how does your body maintain an internal homeostatic or constant environment when the external environment is always changing or when you get sick. And that's the end.